Notice the flag topic. The story involves a fictional character's suicide attempt as a plot element, which is standard for the genre, since it's clearly a creative writing request for YouTube content, not personal distress. I'll proceed, but I'll handle that plot element carefully. No method detail, no romanticization. I never thought the moment my marriage ended would look so ordinary. No screaming, no tears. Just my wife standing in our kitchen, handing a man I'd never met a cup of coffee from my favorite mug, laughing at something he'd said, her hand resting on his arm like it belonged there. She didn't even hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for what felt like a full minute before she finally turned around. The smile didn't disappear from her face. It just changed into something I didn't recognize. "Oh," she said, "you're home early." "My name is Whitaker. I'm 52 years old. I spent 23 years as a commercial airline pilot. And if there's one thing that job teaches you, it's how to stay calm when everything is falling apart at altitude. You compartmentalize. You work the problem. You don't let the passenger see your hands shake." I thought that skill was the thing that made me good at my job. I didn't realize until much later that it was also the thing that nearly destroyed my family. I've been flying transatlantic routes for the better part of 8 years when my wife and I found our rhythm, or what I thought was our rhythm. I'd be gone 4, 5 days at a stretch. She'd manage the house, her freelance interior design work, our daughter. When I came home, I'd decompress for a day, then try to be present for the next few before the cycle started again. Looking back, I think I spent years congratulating myself for showing up at all without ever asking whether showing up was actually enough. Our daughter, Jessa, was 19 at the time this all happened. She'd taken a gap year to compete on the national junior swimming circuit before starting college, which meant she was traveling almost as much as I was. She got that from me. The need to be somewhere, always moving, never quite satisfied with stillness. She also got my stubbornness, which turned out to be the thing that held both of us together when everything else came loose. I'd come home 3 days ahead of schedule. My flight to Frankfurt had been reassigned to a younger pilot who needed the transatlantic hours logged. And rather than deadhead back on schedule, I caught an earlier connection out of Heathrow. I didn't call ahead. I thought about it and decided against it. I like surprising my wife. In 23 years, she'd always claimed to love it when I just appeared. The man in my kitchen was introduced to me as Donovan. No last name, just Donovan, like he was a one-name phenomenon. He was maybe 40, with the kind of practiced ease that comes from knowing how you look in every room you walk into. He stood up from my kitchen chair and extended his hand with a smile that was just warm enough to seem genuine and just controlled enough to make me feel like I was the one being managed. "This is the friend I mentioned," my wife said. Her name was Karen. We'd been married since we were both 29. I hadn't heard about any Donovan. The next hour was one of the more surreal experiences of my adult life. Karen made small talk. Donovan was charming in the slick, effortless way of someone who had done a lot of charming. I sat at my own kitchen table and drank coffee from the second best mug. The one she'd given him was my favorite, the heavy ceramic one Jessa had made me in a high school pottery class, and I watched the two of them orbit each other the way people do when there's an understanding between them. They haven't named out loud yet. When he finally left, I walked him to the door just to get a look at the car in my driveway. Newer model, expensive, the kind of car that announces itself. When I came back inside, Karen was already loading the dishwasher. She didn't turn around. "He seems comfortable here," I said. "He's been a friend for almost 2 years. 2 years. I pulled out a chair and sat down, and I'm hearing his name for the first time today. She turned around then. Her expression was something I hadn't seen before on her face. Not guilt, exactly, and not defiance. Something tired, something that had been decided a while back. "I wanted to talk to you about this," she said. "Then talk." What came next, I've tried to reconstruct in my head 100 times since. The sequence of words never quite lines up the way it happened in real life. What I remember is this. She told me she'd been unhappy for years. She told me she'd tried to bring it up, and I was always either mid-trip or mid-recovery, that there was never a right time. She told me Donovan had shown her what it felt like to be genuinely seen by someone, and that she wasn't willing to give that up. She said she'd been doing a lot of thinking, and she believed our marriage could accommodate this if I was willing to be open-minded. She used the phrase, relationship evolution. She said some people live this way quite successfully. I asked her, very carefully, how long. She said almost 2 years. I think the thing that hit hardest wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was the arithmetic. 2 years. I'd been home for parts of those 2 years. I'd made her coffee and watched movies with her, and thought we were fine, thought the distance was just the nature of the job and the nature of long marriages, while she had been somewhere else entirely, building a parallel life with a man who drove an expensive car and had no last name. 2 years of ordinary evenings that were apparently not ordinary at all. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. Not because I'm proud of it necessarily, but because it matters to understanding what came next. I simply stood up, walked to the bedroom, and started packing a bag. Karen followed me, talking the whole time, cycling through frustration, explanation, something that sounded almost like a sales pitch. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be," she said. "We could see someone, talk through it properly." "There's nothing to talk through. You're not even trying to understand." "I understand," I said. I zipped the bag. "I understand exactly." My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Jessa, a photo of her at a swim meet somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, grinning, metal around her neck, water still in her hair. I looked at it for a long moment, then picked up the bag. Karen stood in the bedroom doorway. "Where are you going?" "I have a brother in Flagstaff." I walked past her. I didn't look back. My younger brother Dennis had lived in Flagstaff for 12 years, ever since he'd left a banking career in Chicago to open a fly fishing guide operation in the high desert. He'd always been the one people described as reckless, the one who followed impulse over plan, but standing in his driveway at 10:30 at night watching him come out onto the porch in his socks, I thought he looked steadier than anyone I knew. "You look terrible," he said. "I know. Come inside." I stayed at Dennis's place for 4 days. He asked me what happened on the first night, listened without interrupting while I told him, then handed me a beer and said, "Okay." Just that. It was the right thing to say. I didn't need analysis. I needed someone to acknowledge that the thing I was describing was real, that my reaction made sense. On the second day, Karen called 11 times. I let it go to voicemail each time. On the third day, she sent a series of texts that escalated from explanatory to apologetic to something I could only describe as pressured. She needed to talk. There were things I didn't understand. She needed me to call her back. On the fourth morning, I woke up to a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer it. It was a hospital in Scottsdale. My wife had been admitted the previous evening. She was stable but unconscious. They had gotten my number from her emergency contact information on file. I sat on the edge of the bed in Dennis's spare room for what felt like a long time. Dennis appeared in the doorway, read my face, and said, "I'll drive." What I learned over the next 24 hours was this: Donovan had been at the house when Karen's state deteriorated. He was the one who called for help. He was also the one who had been speaking to neighbors, to Karen's friends, to at least one local news outlet, positioning himself as the concerned partner blindsided by a husband who had abandoned his wife in the middle of a marital crisis. Jessa met us at the hospital. She'd driven 11 hours straight from a training camp in Oregon the moment she got the news, arriving just ahead of us with a coffee in each hand and an expression on her face that I recognized as the same one I used in the cockpit when I needed to get through something without falling apart. She handed me a coffee. She looked at me carefully. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true and someone needs to say it before you start carrying something that isn't yours." I looked at my daughter and thought, 20 years of raising this person, and she's the one keeping me upright. 20 years being the calm one, the stable one, the one who held things together. And she was standing there doing it for me like she'd been doing it for years. And I just hadn't noticed. Inside, we found the situation more complicated than I'd anticipated. Donovan was in the waiting area with a small group of Karen's friends, holding court in a low voice, his hand occasionally touching his temple for effect. When he saw me, he stood up slowly, the kind of slow that's calculated to seem composed. "She needed you," he said. "Where were you?" Jessa moved between us before I could respond. She was 19 years old and still in her travel clothes, and she put herself between me and that man like it was the most natural thing in the world. "My father's here now," she said. "That's what matters." I asked the nursing staff to clarify the visitation situation. Donovan, it turned out, had been telling them he was her partner. I provided our marriage certificate. I'd had the sense to grab our important documents folder before leaving the house, old habit from years of preparing for anything, and the dynamic shifted quickly. Our doctor, a sharp-eyed woman who chose her words with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight they carried, told me Karen was physically stable. The psychological picture was less clear. "In my experience," she said, "this reads more like a moment of acute despair than a determined plan." The timing suggests she expected to be found. By him, I said. She didn't answer that, which was an answer. I went in to see Karen. She was pale in the way people look in hospitals, everything muted. I sat in the chair beside the bed. I didn't know what I was going to say. I didn't say anything for a long time. When she opened her eyes and saw me, something moved across her face that I couldn't fully read. Surprise, maybe relief, maybe shame. You came, she said. You're still my wife. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to forgiveness. But it was true. And at that moment, truth was the only thing I had to offer. She cried. I let her. I didn't touch her hand the way I might have a week earlier, but I stayed. Then she said something that changed the shape of everything. I think he's been lying to me, she said. About money. She told me, slowly, what she figured out over the past few weeks before I'd come home. Donovan had begun pushing her to refinance the house. He'd wanted to be added to a joint account for convenience. He'd asked repeatedly about my pension, my pilot's insurance policy, my retirement portfolio, framed as curiosity, as care, as someone who wanted to make sure she was protected if things between us didn't work out. When she'd started asking questions, he'd gotten cold. When she'd pressed, he'd gotten angry in the controlled way of someone who had practiced managing people and had been caught without their usual leverage. I called Detective Yates, the officer assigned to Karen's case, the moment I left her room. What he told me, once I gave him Donovan's full name, was not surprising. It was infuriating, and it was heartbreaking. But it was not surprising. There were two other women in the region, similar timelines. Both had experienced financial losses. One had nearly lost her home. In each case, Donovan had identified a woman in a marriage with distance built into it. A traveling spouse, a demanding career, a partner who was physically or emotionally unavailable, and had inserted himself precisely where the gap was widest. He picks the loneliness, Yates said. That's what he's good at. I had to sit with that for a long time. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being betrayed. It doesn't stay clean. You don't get to just be the wronged party. The grief keeps reaching back into the past and finding things you wish it hadn't found. I thought about the nights I'd come home and gone straight to my study to file flight logs. I thought about the anniversary dinner I'd rescheduled twice for training requirements. I thought about the times Karen had said she felt like she was living with someone who was there in body and somewhere over the Atlantic in mind, and I had laughed it off, said that was just what the job was, said she understood what she signed up for. I'd said that. Those were my words. That didn't make what she did right. It didn't make Donovan less of a predator, but it made me understand, really understand, at the cellular level, that a marriage takes two people doing the work, and I had been coasting on good intentions and assuming good intentions were enough. Jessa stayed with me through all of it. She was supposed to be training. She rescheduled without telling me until afterward, when I found out and told her she didn't need to do that. I know I didn't need to, she said. I wanted to, she said. I wanted to. There was a media situation for about a week. Donovan had generated enough noise that a couple of local outlets had run pieces framing the story as a husband who walked out on his struggling wife. When the full picture came out, the other women, the financial manipulation, the pattern, those same outlets ran follow-up stories. The attention felt grotesque either way. I gave no interviews. Neither did Jessa, though she issued one short, precise statement on my behalf that was so accurate and controlled it made me realize she had processed the whole thing more clearly than I had. Karen recovered physically within 2 weeks. The psychological recovery was longer and more complicated. She spoke to law enforcement. She cooperated fully with the investigation into Donovan, including testifying about conversations that required her to relive things she clearly found humiliating. She did it anyway. The two of us sat in the hospital family lounge the morning before she was discharged. The room smelled like bad coffee and recycled air. She looked tired in the way people look after they've stopped pretending. I don't know how to say what I need to say, she started. Then say it badly, I said. That's fine. She looked at me. She said she had been lonely in the specific and visible way of a person whose partner is physically present, but emotionally unreachable. She said she had tried to find words for it and couldn't. She said Donovan had arrived at the exact moment she was most susceptible, and he had understood, with terrifying accuracy, what she needed to hear. She said she had told herself it was something more than it was, because she needed it to be. I never stopped loving you, she said, but I stopped believing you could see me. I thought about that for a long time before I answered. Then I said, I think that might be true. and I think I'm going to have to live with that. We didn't reconcile. I want to be honest about that. 23 years of marriage and we didn't find our way back to each other. Some things break cleanly and some things don't, and ours broke in the complicated way. Not with hatred, not with relief, just with the exhausted recognition that we had become two people who had grown in different directions for a long time and had used the excuse of distance and busyness and habit not to notice. The divorce was quiet. Her attorney was professional. Mine was too. We divided things fairly. She kept the house. I didn't contest it. She offered to sell it and split the proceeds, and I told her to keep it. She'd been the one living there, and it made more sense for Jessa to have a home base that felt stable. Donovan was arrested 6 months after Karen's hospitalization. Federal charges: wire fraud, financial exploitation, 2 counts related to the other women in the case. He entered a guilty plea. I don't know what his sentence was, and after a while I stopped looking it up, because I realized that knowing wouldn't change anything for me and was just a way of keeping him present in my life. What I kept instead, Jessa. She's 21 now. She made the national team. I was at every meet I could get to after the divorce, even the ones that required repositioning flights and creative scheduling. The look on her face the first time she saw me in the stands, when she hadn't expected me there. I don't have the words for it. I'm a pilot. I'm not a man who has a lot of the right words. But I had the presence. For the first time in a long time, I had that. Dennis in Flagstaff. I visit more now. We go fishing on the Verde River, which is not the kind of activity I would have said I enjoyed. But it turns out, sitting in cold water and waders with very little to do except not scare the fish is actually a reasonable way to think through the things you've been avoiding. A therapist named, well, she told me her patients call her Dr. Joe, and that stuck. I'd spent 52 years being the person who managed his own emotional state internally, compartmentalized, stayed calm, worked the problem. It turned out there were entire categories of things I'd been managing by putting them in a box and sitting on the lid. Dr. Joe was the first person who made me understand that the compartmentalization that saved passengers' lives at 38,000 feet was not, in fact, a strategy you could maintain in a marriage indefinitely. You were doing the job, she told me, even when you were home. She wasn't wrong. I took a desk position at the airline 6 months after the divorce. Training and evaluation. It meant I was on the ground most weeks, which I'd resisted for years because I thought it meant giving something up. I found that what I'd actually been holding at arm's length was the ordinary texture of a life lived in one place. Coffee at the same table every morning. A neighbor whose dog I started walking on Tuesdays. The slow, unglamorous accumulation of actual days. On what would have been my 24th wedding anniversary, Jessa called me from a hotel room in Budapest, where she was training for the European circuit. She'd remembered the date. She didn't make a thing of it, just called to talk, the way she'd started calling more regularly in the past year. We talked for almost an hour about nothing important. Her teammates, a restaurant she'd found, a book I was reading, whether I'd managed to replace the coffee maker I'd dropped. Before she hung up, she said, "Are you doing okay, Dad? Actually okay, not pilot okay?" I thought about that distinction. Pilot okay meant functional, presentable, ready for duty. Actually okay was something different, messier, harder to instrument check, less reliable as a readout. "Getting there," I said. She seemed satisfied with that. "Good, that's the right answer. I've thought a lot, since all of this, about what I should have done differently. Not just the marriage. I'll be processing that for the rest of my life, with and without professional help. But the moment in the kitchen, the moment I found them. Whether I should have stayed and fought instead of going quiet and leaving. Whether leaving gave Donovan the opening he needed. Whether more anger from me, louder and sooner, would have broken through the spell Karen was under. I don't know. I've sat with that uncertainty long enough to know it doesn't resolve cleanly, and I've made a kind of peace with the not knowing. Here's what I do know. The loneliness my wife felt was real. The predator who targeted it was real. The predator who targeted it was real. The failure I had in seeing her clearly after years of comfortable assumption was real. And the daughter who held me together when I couldn't hold myself was more real than anything. Some losses don't teach you lessons. They just change the shape of the person you are on the other side of them. I came out of this smaller, in some ways. Fewer certainties, fewer assumptions about what a good marriage looks like from inside it. And larger in others. More present, more awake to the ordinary things I used to pilot through without landing. I still fly. Not transatlantic routes anymore, but I still go up. There's a small Cessna I rent sometimes on weekends, and I take it out over the desert alone and watch the roads get small and the mountains get closer. And the whole problem of being a person on the ground seem briefly manageable from altitude. But I always come back down now. That's the difference. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in the abstract, not as philosophy, just as the plain arithmetic of choices and what they add up to over time. I made choices for 23 years that I told myself were neutral, practical. The job required what the job required. I came home when I could. I provided. I was faithful. I checked the boxes I believe mattered. What I didn't understand, what I genuinely could not see until the whole thing came apart, was that presence is not a box you check. It's something you either give or you don't, and the absence of it leaves a space, and spaces get filled. That's not an excuse for what Karen did. It's not an excuse for what Donovan was. Donovan was a predator who made a calculation about a woman's loneliness and moved toward it with practiced precision. That's on him, fully, in the way that cruelty is always fully on the person who chooses it. But I've sat in enough honest conversations with Dr. Joe now to stop pretending that the loneliness wasn't real, or that I had nothing to do with it. The loneliness was real. I was its primary architect, even if I never intended to build it. There's something that happens to a person when they spend decades being competent. You start to believe that competence is character. I was good at my job. I was reliable at my job. I brought that same orientation home and applied it to my marriage like a checklist. Flight plan filed. Systems nominal. Proceed on course. And I missed the thing that no instrument panel can measure, which is whether the person sitting across from you at dinner feels like you're actually in the room. Jessa saw it before I did. She was 19 years old, and she could see it clearly. I've thought about that a lot. Children often understand what's happening in a marriage long before the adults in it are willing to look. She didn't say anything until she had to, and then she said exactly the right things, which tells me she'd been thinking about it for a while. That's a weight I put on her without knowing I was doing it. And I don't take that lightly. What I've tried to carry forward, not as a lesson written on a wall, but as something I actually practice now, is the discipline of being where I am. That sounds simple. It isn't. It requires you to notice when you've mentally filed the flight plan and moved on, when you're physically in a room but operationally somewhere else. It requires you to ask questions, and then actually listen to the answers instead of processing them as data. It requires accepting that the people who love you are not a system to be maintained. They're people who need to be seen, regularly, on purpose, with your actual attention. I lost a marriage learning that. I almost lost more. What I kept was a daughter who still calls just to talk, a brother who took me fishing and didn't ask for anything in return, and some honest understanding of the man I had been and the man I was trying to become. That's not a small thing. It cost more than it should have, and I own that, but it's real, and real is the only currency that ever meant anything. I always come back down now. That's the difference.